Alright, taking a look at the front springs, the old versus the new. You can see the Racertech spring is a little shorter, but the stock spring, about that much of it was fully compressed anyway once it was installed. So this basically just acted as a spacer up here anyway, so it wasn't really even usable spring. The rear is actually the opposite. The Racertech spring is just a little bit taller than the stock spring. You notice the other difference. The XC came with a dual rate setup in the rear to begin with. If you see this puny little spring, with my RZR sitting on the ground and the weight on it, this spring was pretty much fully compressed. So it's pretty much only used when you jump or come off the ground. This Racertech spring, it's going to take a lot to compress that big beefy spring. I think these are going to work a lot better. You want to make sure when you rip your package open that you pay attention to these two springs. The shorter one is going to go on the rear with your dual rate spring, and the longer one is going to go on the front. Now the way mine was packaged was a little deceiving at first, because they were packaged together like this, all wrapped up nicely in foam, and these separate, which would make you think these would be the individual springs and those would be the dual rate springs. But as you can see, that definitely won't work. So you just want to make sure you put your short spring on the rear, long spring goes on the front. The directions for the 800XC say that you should be able to back off your adjuster nut on top all the way until you can take the springs off and put the springs back on, and then you would adjust this nut down until you just make contact with the spring, which is zero preload, and then you go from there. On mine, I still had to compress the spring at least an inch or two in order to get this bottom ring in to lock it in place. So there's no way on mine to start out with zero preload. Now, I used an automotive McPherson strut compressor to compress my strings, but you can get a Lona tool from AutoZone, a little smaller handheld 2 bolts and clamps type spring compressor that'll work fine for you. Now, this is just a closer look at the rear spring before I compress it to install the lock collar at the bottom. As you can see, probably about a ½ an inch that has to be compressed. So once this is installed and the adjuster nut backed all the way off, we are at about a ½ inch of preload. I already removed my stock springs and I'm installing the new springs, but what you do is after you compress your spring down, you'll slide this bump stop in here up out of your way. You can slide this collar out, and then going back in, you do the same thing. You just slide that collar right back in, make sure it seats on the bottom of your shock, and then you release the pressure from your compressor, and you're all set. Now my front springs, I was actually able to back off the preload adjuster enough to get zero preload, and right about there, just a couple threads in, is where it finally makes contact, where you get to that zero preload. But as you can see from the stock spring, it's quite a bit longer. I still had to compress this spring before I could remove it from the shock. So I wasn't able to just back this off and take the spring off like the instructions would suggest. But not a problem. Like I said, just get your cheap Lona tool from AutoZone. You're all set. And the instructions say you should start out with a 1/4 inch of preload on both front and rear shocks. Now the front, I had a 1/4 inch at 0, so I've gone ahead and adjusted it to a ½ inch. So now I've got my 1/4 inch preload on the front to start out with. The rear, because like I said, we've already got at least a ½ maybe more preload on the rear to begin with the nut all the way off. So I'm going to start out with this nut all the way off as far as it'll go, and then we'll fine tune it from there. You want to make sure you toss some grease in your eyelets while you've got it apart. Got a little ball that pivots in there. On mine they were so dry they would barely even move. Alright, I took her out in the snow and took a couple laps around the driveway like they say to go ahead and get your springs settled in. Now we're going to double check our ride height. We're right about, that's actually just a hair under 10 inches, which is what I had before the lift kit and the new springs. So we definitely need to add some preload to the rear. Let's take a look up front. Alright, so up front we're back to 10 1/4 now. Now, we started out with 10 1/2 with the stock springs and no lift kit. So we definitely need to add some preload up front as well. Alright, now I've added 1 inch of preload from our starting position on both front and rear. So now we just got to go take it for a lap around the parking lot, get the suspension settled in, and get another measurement. Alright, that ought to do it. Let's see where we're at. We've got 10 3/4 in the rear, which is only a 3/4 inch lift with a 2 inch lift and new springs. Guess we need more preload. Alright, well, since I'm too impatient to go in small increments, I went ahead and added another 1/2 inch to the rear, which brings us to the maximum on the rear. And I put another 1/4 inch up front, which also brings us to the maximum on the front, for 1.5 inches total, front and rear. Now we just got to go take another lap around and see what happens. Alright, well, that puts me at 11 3/4 in the rear, which gives me 1 3/4 of lift. Now, this might be a little stiff for some people, depending on how you ride your RZR. I was going for the maximum ground clearance because I do a lot of mudding, going in deep mud, ruts, things like that. And I was just tired of dragging my belly pan. Alright, so there we are at 12 inches in the front now, which gives me 1.5 inches of lift in the front. We have 1 3/4 in the rear. Now, this might not be your optimal setting for jumping and racing and that sort of stuff. But like I said, the kind of riding I do, deep mud, deep ruts, things like that, I was going for the most ground clearance I can get and still have somewhat of a decent ride. Now, obviously, the real test will come when I can go out on the trails and see how it actually handles. But you can always fine-tune it from there. That's the nice part about it. So, until the weather's a little nicer, I don't think I'll be testing it out on the trails right away. 0 degrees here right now, but there it is. Racertech lift kit and dual rate spring installation on a 2014 800XC.